My paper today is called Islam, Homosexuality, and Secular Boundaries in an Immigrant City. The position of Muslims across the world on the question of homosexuality has become a topic of increasing scholarly and popular interest in recent years. Some scholars have analyzed Muslim constructions of same-sex desire as dynamic expressions of various moral and cultural orientations. Others have noted the way that Muslim attitudes about same-sex desire have come to serve in the writing of some analysts as a kind of litmus test for the compatibility between Islam and democracy, or as an index for the capacity of Muslims to assimilate successfully into secular societies. Using the case study of a gay rights debate in one small Midwestern city, my ethnographic work contributes to theorizing the role that ideas about Islam, homosexuality, and public space play in the way civilizational and community boundaries have come to be imagined in contemporary liberal secular societies. My work on this subject is based on an examination of the social processes that surrounded a debate that brought Muslims and non-Muslims into close contestation and collaboration in Hamtramck, Michigan. The ordinance referendum debates in question lasted about 5 months, during which time self-identified religious and secular humanist social actors formulated campaigns to oppose or support an ordinance that had come to symbolize the kind of city Hamtramck should be and the way that Muslims should assimilate into it. Known historically as a Polish Catholic enclave, in recent years, Hamtramck, Michigan has also become known as a city with one of the highest concentrations of Muslim residents in the U.S. The city's Yemeni, Bangladeshi, and Bosnian Muslim communities now make up what some people estimate to be about 40% of the population. So 40%. The Hamtramck Human Rights Ordinance that passed through City Council in spring 2008 was designed to protect city residents against discrimination in housing, employment, and public accommodation. The legislation was controversial to some because it included sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression among the list of protected classes. This made the ordinance practically and symbolically a significant instrument for extending protections to Hamtramck's LGBTQ communities on a municipal level beyond those offered in Michigan or on the federal level. The ordinance was valued by some Hamtramck residents as a powerful statement of acceptance for GLBTQ groups in the city, yet other Hamtramck residents, including both Muslims and Christians, resisted the ordinance. Their opposition campaign was formulated around two basic ideas: that the ordinance threatened the proper balance between church and state, and that it legitimated immoral public expressions of sexuality in the city. Some ordinance proponents were particularly puzzled by the Muslim opposition, since they believed that the vulnerable position of Muslims in the post-9/11 era should make them staunch allies in any kind of progressive, rights-based struggle. When this position failed to materialize, the Human Rights Ordinance issue brought about a dramatic sense of disidentification between progressive and conservative groups in the city that fractured a range of personal, institutional, and community relationships and friendships. In Hamtramck, conflicts over the Human Rights Ordinance acted as a rich and generative nexus point for the exchange of ideas about the incorporation of Muslim values and expressive forms in the public arena. The issue also opened up questions for majority city residents about how to tolerate intolerance or make sense of conflicting claims to justice when the rights-based claims of one group are experienced as an infringement upon the cultural or religious ethics of another disenfranchised minority group. Talal Assad recently gave an interview in the wake of the Charlie Hebdo incident that was published and disseminated online this month under the title, "Do Muslims Belong in the West?" Here, Assad talks about the ways that public discourses about the recent incident in France and other incidents of violence linked to those who identify as Muslim problematically evade critical analysis of social problems, contexts, and specific actors. Assad describes how in this rhetoric, Islam itself is cast as the problem, as a system in need of reform. Here, Islam is identified as a flawed and incompletely modern system due to the way that it supposedly inculcates a kind of dependency within its followers on transcendent forces which lead them to behave in irrational and destructive ways. Here, Islam is constructed as the other to an idealized form of secularism in which supposedly nothing is held to be transcendent, and which followers are oriented only to rationality, neutrality, and freedom in a way that supposedly safeguards against any arbitrary expressions of violence. To move out of such dualities, Assad prompts us to consider the kinds of transcendencies that secularists engage in, and to imagine Islam as a living tradition that is emerging in dialectic with secularism as another living tradition. Secularists' transcendencies that Assad mentions may include the idea of linear cultural and moral progress, an elevated idea of humanity with only one historical trajectory, and belief in absolute power of the intellect, among others. In line with Assad's program, this paper, or my work on this issue, studies how secular transcendencies were deployed in Hamtramck during the gay rights debate, and how Muslim minority actors served to question them. My examination of the power relations that shaped the Hamtramck debates offers a grounded, municipal level and ethnographic perspective on larger patterns by which mainstream liberal secular ideologies on national and international levels legitimate and perpetuate themselves through the management, containment, and appropriation of minority religious difference. My work on this topic also continues Assad's examination of how secular logics generate discursive constructions of violence that are used to cast out Muslims from the West. Finally, the study also wishes to achieve a sense perhaps of possible alternatives to such a casting out that could have happened in the context of a small and diverse city. So Rafiq, a Bangladeshi community leader who had grown up in Hamtramck, explained the driving force behind the Muslim opposition movement in this way. He said, Islam forbids homosexuality altogether. So if the city wants to establish something that goes against the religious teaching, then chances are that people who closely follow the religion will be against it. This interpretation of Islam expressed here by Rafiq typified the Muslim public voice on the issue in Hamtramck. This Muslim voice on the issue was coherent and unified across generational lines and across ethnic lines in all the press interviews that I read and in all of the public speeches on the issue that I attended. Private interviews with Muslim social actors yielded some different results, and Muslim community leaders in nearby Detroit and the surrounding suburbs were in no way publicly unified on this issue. Some spoke out emphatically in favor of the ordinance. The construction of the apparent consensus among Muslims in Hamtramck against the ordinance was a complicated phenomenon that some linked to the official position that area mosques had taken on the issue. I discussed the absence of the queer or progressive Muslim voice in Hamtramck with Jamal, one of the founders of a GLBTQ organization for Middle Eastern Americans headquartered in the region. Although a strong advocate for queer Arabs and Muslims in the community, Jamal said that he himself would not be interested in mobilizing to support the pro-GLBTQ civil rights measure like the one in Hamtramck at the current time. Instead, Jamal believed his efforts would be better spent creating social support networks for young gay-identified Muslims and Arabs in the area through which they could maintain their privacy while some of their basic needs were met. The anti-ordinance Muslims in the city also experienced a degree of hesitation about coming out openly to express their sentiments regarding the ordinance. It was not until a powerful national-level Christian rights organization known as the American Family Association began its petition campaign in the city several weeks after the ordinance passed that the Muslim opposition movement began to take shape. Some leaders represented their bond with the American Family Association as a strategic, although awkward alliance, in which they could learn how to run a campaign. Muslim leaders also figured the alliance with the AFA as a kind of buffer against anti-Muslim vitriol that might otherwise have been directed against them if this issue was seen as their issue alone. Yet, in joining with the American Family Association, the Muslim conservative actors began to revoice and disseminate some prepackaged Christian right rhetorical forms that were demeaning to LGBTQ people, and they did so in a somewhat undigested manner. Even after the Family Values Alliance solidified in this way, the progressive social actors that I interviewed remained hopeful that they could find common ground with the Muslim ordinance opponents in time for the vote. One of these ordinance supporters explained, "We need to send a message to Muslims, and it should be this. We have to join with diverse groups and support diversity, including Bangladeshis, Arabs, gays, all the Muslims. We have to put it that way, and it will work. We have to say that if they go after the gays, then they'll come after the Muslims next." In these narratives, ordinance supporters described their belief that it was their responsibility to instruct, demonstrate, and teach through example so that Muslim residents of the city could learn to share in a collective vision of community progress and change that would benefit them all in time for the vote. When these efforts failed to bear fruit, the rhetoric of the pro-ordinance activists began sometimes to take on a different tone, and some activists began to make some generalizations about the Muslim community in Hamtramck. One of them explained to me, Christian society went through the Reformation. We went through the Enlightenment. Islamic society still has to do that. And the places where these people are coming from, like places like Iran and Saudi Arabia too, they execute gay people. I don't think the answer is pinning the blame on them or blowing them all up. It's about building democracy, getting them out of poverty, raising the education level. Once we have things like that, what results will be more respect for women's rights and gender and everything, and with that education, there comes less fundamentalist and more secularist worldviews. So third world feminist scholars have traced the way in which colonial and imperial systems have justified their intrusions into Muslim nations with reference to the need to liberate their women from tyrannical gender systems. A subsequent wave of scholarship has suggested that rhetoric about the way they treat their gays is being used similarly as a strategy to promote the idea of Western superiority. A scholar named Jasmine Poor has labeled this tendency Homo Nationalism. Across the ages, Western representations of Muslim ethics regarding the public visibility of same-sex desire have depended upon Orientalist distortions. At the height of colonialism, travelers to the East collectively constructed a trope of the debauched Muslim other who engages in same-sex activities as part of the Orientalist lexicon, opposing the passionate, violent, and instinct-driven Muslims and Arabs to the civilizationally superior, sexually chaste Western self. Yet, as Charles Taylor and others explain, in the dominant liberal secular social imagination, it is no longer that ability to constrain transgressive sexuality that's come to stand in as the higher marker of our Western civilization. Instead, it's the capacity for granting individuals the freedom to fully experience and assert their transgressive or true sexual identity that's now considered the highest standard of what it means to be civilized. So with the assumption that their Muslim neighbors' opposition stemmed from their connection to foreign and extremist attitudes and regimes, reports and rumors began to spread in the community that some of the most prominent and well-loved Muslim leaders were had publicly condoned violence against gays in general, or had threatened violence against specific individuals, or that they were likely to start doing so. Some young pro-gay activists told me that they would probably have been attacked by an angry mob if they had attended one of the Vote No rallies. They made ululating noises to illustrate this point. Other community members described the rallies as having whipped up Muslims into a frenzy of hatred, after which they speculated anything could have happened. So worried about the rift that was widening in the community, Rafiq explained, I don't know what the outcome of this involvement is going to be. We need to get into mainstream politics, but we need to make sure before we fight for one thing that we're not jeopardizing everything, because you don't know what's coming next. We don't know who's going to be elected or what kind of Patriot Act is going to be imposed. And we'll need these people then. We will need all of Hamtramck to come to our aid. In this interview, Rafiq also expressed some discomfort about the way Muslims in the city had accepted and revoiced the American Family Association framing of the issue wholesale, and described how it led them to missing the opportunity to express their point of view, which could have been articulated in different terms. At the same time, some ordinance supporters in the city regretted the way that they translated their distress over the Muslim position into such angry terms. Queer activists also regretted some other aspects of their strategy, such as the way that the city may have hurried into the ordinance. And they acknowledged that queer visibility in Hamtramck was only just beginning to be a programmatic effort with the passing of the ordinance. City leaders and queer activists in nearby Ferndale, who were involved with the Hamtramck case, explained that in Ferndale, it was due mainly to such processes of slowly coming into visibility and making local ties slowly over time that allowed the LGBTQ community there to gain enough social capital to achieve their legitimization and eventually pass legislation like the Hamtramck Human Rights Ordinance. Yet in Hamtramck, shortcuts taken by both sides led to polarization and a damaging distrust in the city which had long held the reputation as being a haven for religious and other kinds of minorities. The Human Rights Ordinance in Hamtramck was in fact repealed, and LGBTQ community lost a valuable and meaningful set of protections. Most people in the city attributed this outcome to the power of the Muslim vote. In the aftermath of Election Day, the theme of repairing relations and beginning new projects to foster unity became a common talking point in public and private venues and community roundtable discussions. For example, some people began to think creatively about how to bring Muslims and GLBTQ minorities together in order to pave the way for future coalitions, such as through educating each other or developing business-leading associations. They hoped that the knowledge that they gained within the human rights debates could be used in the service of developing better grounded political projects. In conclusion, Hamtramck citizens living together in this densely populated, deindustrialized, and financially strapped Rust Belt city really have no other choice but to capitalize on the bonds that unite them as they negotiate a shared vision for a safe and prosperous city.